Okay, welcome to the Fetch Endpoint demo. We're going to take the user story that we developed in the basic React demo, where we had flat files with our dummy data. We're now going to reach out to a backend and actually get the data using the Fetch API. So I'm going to assume that you've watched that, understood that, followed that. So what we're going to cover here is the introduction, the understanding of what state is in a React component, and the use of this use state hook to create and manage state. So it's only when state changes does your component function get recalled, otherwise it doesn't get recalled and you don't get re-renderings. So we have to create essentially variables within a state, and we can manage those, and if those variables then change, then the page is re-rendered. So we'll talk a bit about state and this use state hook, and then I'll introduce you to the Fetch API, which is very straightforward. We use that to go and issue a get or a put or a post or a delete to our endpoint. In this case, in this video, we're just going to do a get, and we're going to recover some data from the endpoint because we're going to pass a string that specifies what the endpoint, which endpoint we're trying to reach. And we will embed that fetch within our component, and we'll see it get data and render on the screen. But that won't be enough because we'll have created some state, and we will have used the Fetch API, would have got some data, we would have changed the state, and the page will re-render, which will cause a fetch, which will cause a change of state, and so on, and we get this infinite loop. So we have to introduce the use effect hook and to ensure that that function only gets called once. So I'll take you through all of those particular points. Okay, so here's the code. So I'll just take you through the code quickly. We have our app component, and I've introduced these comments to structure where our code goes. And I'd like you to do exactly the same in your components so we can quickly navigate. Everybody understands we're all using the same layout where all the code lives. So we'll have an initiation. This is where we set up lots of variables typically. Then we'll have in here our state, and also things like use effect or use context where we're using them later on, not in this video. Then our handlers, and then the view. Now sometimes the view, you could be setting up some JSX component by hand, p blah 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 blah, for instance, and you can be, it's all to do with the view, so you can include things like that. So that would go in there. Our handlers would go in here, and sometimes we might also have additional helpers as well. So we'd have perhaps something called helpers, which would go in here. So some additional functions which aren't handlers but are used to do various jobs. So that's the structure. And as I nip through some of the other components, hopefully you'll see that and you'll stick to that. Okay, so do another save. All right, so all the hard work's in the components. So we want to, let's just do students. That's pretty much where we're going to focus on today. So we go into our views. We have students. So I've popped those structuring comments in there. I've not bothered with any props validation. There aren't any props here, so it's not complaining. So this is fine. So this will call a card container, which will have children. So that's in layout. So that's all in card. So here's the card container, and here's the card. And then here are the, we're passing children we're not passing any props other than children into these, but so it's only those we have to worry about here, and an appropriate prop type seems to be node. Element, but it works as well, but there are sometimes things that you pass that don't seem to work that well, so node seems to be a better choice. So we've done our props. Let's have a quick look at our layout, because we have a prop type in there. So in the header, we passed props, and that included the logged in user. So we had to say what that is. So logged in user string is a string, and it's required. And we're using prop types, which we've had to import. Okay, so it's pretty much the same as the earlier video, and we're going to be doing all of our hard work here in the students view, so in the student component. So we have our file of students, our array of students, and this is the thing that we're going to get rid of. And in here, we're going to create some state where we'll keep the students, and we'll load in from the API using fetch. We'll load in students into our state, and then the state will be a variable. It'll have a slightly different name down here, students, I think. And then we'll work just as before, we work our way through that array, which is in state, and map out the thing. So it'll be pretty much the same, but we'll be working in here. Okay, so everything, you should be familiar with everything. The next step is to go in and really figure out exactly what is state. So to demonstrate the need for state, what we're going to do is try to add a new student to the student list. So we'll need a new student. So I'll just pop in here. I've made one earlier. An object within the details of a new student in it. So new student. Let's get this laid out. So we have a new student object. It has a new name and all the details. So it's this same structure as the objects in our student list. So what we want to do is add that to the end of our list and then see what happens. So we'll do that when we press a button. So we'll add a button down here, button, and add student, it will say, and we'll need to add a handler. So we haven't constructed the handler yet, but we'll construct it up here. It'll be const handle add. Oops. And we'll populate this later. Okay, so there's that function. So we want that function to run when the button's pressed. So down here we're going to go on click. So this is a property of all HTML elements, or the JSX versions of them. So equals, and then we need to put the handler in here. Now we could just go handle add and then call it with the new student. What did I call it? New student. So let me just close that to make things easier to see. Copy. So a new student. Okay, so we call the function with the new student, but that will execute as we render this object. To just immediately call it. So in fact, we want to pass a function which will be called when the button is called. So we make an anonymous function, and then we pass it this code to be run when the button's pressed. So this is a function. So the function header, the function body, it doesn't have a name. It's an anonymous function. You can do that. And you don't need the curly brackets if there's only the one line. So there is a function which we pass to onClick, which will call handle add, and passing it the new student when the button is called. So let's go up here to the function. So it will be passed to student. Now we want to, in our object here, I haven't included a user ID. I'm going to make that as we click the button, because I might want to click the button multiple times and I want to give it different IDs. Otherwise, in this map function here, as we render objects and give them a key if they have the same user ID, React will complain. So here, the first thing before we add a new student to the list, we're going to give it an ID. So student.user ID equals, and we'll use the math.random function, and that will give us a number between 0 and 1. So that's no good. So we'll multiply that by 10,000, 1,000, 10,000, doesn't really matter. And that will give us a real number between 10,000, 0 and 10,000. So probably 4 digits. In fact, definitely up to 4 digits. And because it doesn't, random doesn't return 1 exactly. It's between 0 and 1, but never 1. Okay, and now we need to turn that into an integer. So math.floor. So it's a real that's produced by that. We'll just take it down to the nearest integer. Okay, so that generates a number between 0 and 9,999 and pops it into the user ID. When we press the button twice, it could be very unlikely, but it could be that the two numbers are generated, but that's really unlikely. Okay, so the next thing we want to do, we've fully populated our student object. We now want to put it on the list. So we can go student list dot, and then we can use the push function, push method of an array, and we put the student onto the list, the student list. So we're actually referring here to this list that is up here, so that the scope of this is up here. Okay, so and we might as well, we need to print something off. So actually, this is what I want to print off. Go and get the line. So I want to print to the console log so that we can see what's going on. A string. So this is a template. So it says length of student list, which we've just added something to, and here is the length. So length, it's a property of an array. So student list.length will give us the length of the array. Okay, so we've created a new object. We've built a handler. We put a button in, attach the handler to the button so that when it's clicked, we add a student. So let's save that and then run it. So there's the add button at the bottom. So we'll just open this out fully and we'll inspect so that we can get hold of the console and see what's printed out. Okay, so there is our add button. We'll click on that and we should get a message being pressed, returned on the console. So add student, hooray, the length of the student list is now gone to 12. Actually, that's because I hit it a little second ago. You didn't see that. And then hit it again, 13, 14, 15, 16, and so on. So we're adding this new student to the list lots and lots of times. So it's been successfully added to the list, but it's not being rendered. They're not actually being displayed on the screen. Now, why is that? So if we go back to our code, so the issue is we have an array, student list, and when this function, this component students is run, we run through here, we do a map of all the students, and we render all the cards, and then the function stops. And then when we press the add button, there's nothing to make this function render again. Nothing for the React doesn't run this function again because the state hasn't changed. In fact, there is no state. So we can happily add things to our student list, but we won't get a re-render because we are not updating state. So let's introduce some state, and we'll see what impact that makes. So we create state using a hook called useState. So we have to import that from React. So import useState from React. And then we go down to where we declare our state, and we're going to create some state. We're going to create a variable, put it in state, and get React to watch it for us, looking for changes. Could be anything. So just to make something, this is not what I'm going to do finally. I actually want to put the student list into state, but for the moment, just to show that it could be anything, what I'm going to do is create a variable called length. Okay, and we will keep an eye on the length of the student list, and if it changes, then hopefully the page will be rendered, because length is going to be state. So to make this variable stateful, we use the use hook. So we go const and length, set length, I'll get back to that in a minute, equals use state. So the use state method creates state, and it will return it to us. It'll return two things, the state and a function to change the state. So it's basically just a variable that React keeps track of. So if you create something up here, like a variable here, React doesn't keep track of. If you create it using useState, React keeps track of it and checks to see if it's changed. So useState is what's going to return these two things. That'll return us a little array, actually, with two things in it. The first thing is the variable that we want, and the second is a function to change it. And we can call these things anything we like. I want this to be the length, so I'm going to call it length, and by convention we then call the function set length using camel case like this. So there's a variable with a particular name, and then the function that's called it, we name set in front of it. Now we can give this initial length by popping it in here. So the initial length of student list is student list dot length. So that's what we're going to create. We're going to create a state variable, and we're going to give it an initial value. useState returns two things, and then we can what's called deconstruct them into a variable and a function of our choice. So we give it initial length, but we then need to change the length. So we do that within the handler. This is where we've pushed the student onto the list, which is not in state, and then we print out the length, and then we're going to now set the length. So we call the function, copy set length, and then we pop in the new length, copy dot length. Okay, so set length takes one variable, it's the new value. So we call the set length to change length. Okay, so if we save that now, so now what we're doing, we do exactly what we did before, except that we've created a state variable using useState and give it an initial value. And then when we add a new student to the old student list, we're going to update the length of that array as stored in the state. Now, if this changes, the student should be re-rendered. So now if we go back to our, let's check that it's compiled. Made an error. Oops. useState is one of the things that is in the React module. So we just we need to say that it's not the default thing, it's one of the things. So let's save and refresh. Okay, so as before, we had the student list render, and we're going to add a button, and we should see that we've pushed a new student onto the list, but we also changed state. We updated the length variable, and that should cause the component to re-render, and if it does, it'll run through that list with now the extra student on, who should appear here at the end. So let's press add student, and there we go. Not done quite what I expected. I must have done something wrong with the image. So let's see what happened there. Bad gateway. That's interesting. Do that again. Add student. Oh, there we go. Sometimes the API from where these images come from is a little odd. Anyway, it's worked now, and if I add, we can see here the length of the student list is now 11. So if we press it again, it'll become 12. The state will update, and the page will re-render, and so on. Just keep adding. Okay, so let's go back to the code. So we didn't actually use length, but that doesn't matter. It was a state variable, and which we declared using useState, and we updated it, and when we updated it, the state had changed, and because of that, the function students was run again. So a component won't render again unless its state changes or the state in any of its children changes. So I just add that as a caveat. So this might not change, but if we had down here a child component which had state, and that state changed, then all the way up the tree would re-render. Okay. So now, instead of having an indirect variable length in state, why don't we put the student list into state itself? So we will create a state, which is a list of students, and we'll initialize it with the student list. So we're going to create some state from student list. That's an array. So we'll get back an array, and we need to call that something. So let's just call it students for the moment. So that's all the students. And then we get a function back, which allows us to update the state. Can't spell. Students. All right. And so we're not going to change the length because that's not the state anymore. And we're also not going to change the student list at all. We're going to create a new array in state called students, and we create it from student list, and then we completely ignore student list. So this is getting closer to when we do a fetch. We will create the state from what we get back from the fetch rather than a list up here. So we will pop what we got straight into state. So we're getting very close to the use fetch now and the typical way we do these things. So we've created a new array in state called students, and so we'll just replace student list down here. Okay, so now that becomes students. I don't think we need to change anything else. That wanders through there. And now in our handler, we don't push now onto student list. So we get rid of that. Instead, we're going to change students. Now, there's a correct way and an incorrect way to do this. So let's start with the obvious way. So we're going to take our variable students, and then we're going to push caps lock is on, push a new student. Okay, oops. I'll go down along here, dot method. All right, so a new student. So you might think, well, that's the best way to do it. So we'll push onto that, and then we'll just update the state directly. and not in fact use this set students. We'll just push straight on to that array. Oh, and I want to look at students now rather than student list. Students. V. Okay, I can save that. Then we can go and run this. So let's start a new, well no, rather go and get the console, see what gets printed out. Refresh. Okay, so there are 10 entries. Here's our button. So we press this, we're pushing the new object on the end of students. So we add that. Sure enough, students is now increased. There are now 11 students there. We do it again, 12 and so on. But they're not being rendered. So that way of updating students by pushing onto the end of it doesn't work. So when we do set students, what we're going to update is the place in memory where students lives. Now when we push a new student onto the existing array, students doesn't change. That is a variable that contains the location of this array in memory. And all we did was add to it. We didn't change the array itself. So students actually didn't change. So the state didn't change. So what we have to do is use this set students. Okay, so we're going to go set students. Okay, so you might think, well, all right then. So what I put in here, I'm going to put in the new students value having been pushed. Okay, so good guess, but that won't actually work as well, because all that's going to do is update the old student's memory location with the new student's memory location, which is in fact not changed. Oops, left out an S there. So students actually didn't change. So this isn't going to work either. So we'll do Control Save. Control get rid of this. Restart. So we'll add a student. So now we've got 11, add another student, we've got 12 and so on. But it hasn't re-rendered. And again, going back to the code, that's because we have simply said update students with students, and students is a memory location where an array lives. So we haven't, so students actually doesn't change. So what we have to do is actually create a new array. So we do that by going student. I mean, we don't have this amount of problems when we're doing very simple data structures, like simple data types, like a string or an integer or whatever. This just works as how you might imagine, by putting the new value in. But in the case of more complex data structures like objects and arrays, the name of an array is its location in memory. So you actually have to change where it is in memory. So we're going to create a new array. And in that array, we're going to spread out the contents of the current array. So we use the spread operator, so students. And this would give us exactly what we had before in terms of content. It would live in a new place, and therefore the state would update. But we actually want to add a new object. So instead of doing a push here, we tag new student onto the end of the spread out data. So new student. New student. Just do a quick save. So the new array is formed from the contents of the old array, and then tagged on the end of that the new student, so the new object in that array. Okay, so do Control S and open out this, get the inspect, look at the log. Okay, clear. All right, so there are 10 objects. Now we're going to add a student. Okay, so we've added the new student, popped up here. The length of students is actually need 10, And that's because, if we go back to the code, set students doesn't operate immediately. It's an asynchronous function, so it sets off the contents to be processed, but there's no knowing when that's going to be done. So console log comes straight up, and then it returns. So it sends it off for processing in React, but we don't know when that's going to be done. It sends it off, it's queued, and we come back and do a log. So we haven't updated state yet. So the console log says, well, it's 11. It's 10 items in there because it hasn't updated. So that's a little odd behavior, but if we go back to our button again, so it says 10, there's actually now 11 because it has added it has returned. So if we do an add student again, this should say 11, whereas in fact it should say 12. So update 11, although there are 12. And you can see the new object is being added. So this is a new array that's being created by concatenating these new objects on the end. Okay, so if we go back to our code, so hopefully you now know what state is. State are variables in a React state in which the React monitors the contents of the variable. Well, actually monitors the variable, and if the variable changes through the use of a supplied function, then this causes a re-render of students or the component and any of its child components. Okay, so we now have students which we've populated from a flat file. The rest of the video is going to be about using the fetch API. Okay, so using the fetch API, we're going to go and get our students and put those into state. So rather than using this flat data file here, so what I'm going to do is remove that, so that no longer exists. And then we need to initialize our state with something. We could initialize it with an empty array. I'm actually going to initialize it with a null, and then use the students as a flag to know whether the data has been loaded or not. So the initial value of students will be null. So if we could pop down here, instead of showing the card container and all the students which don't exist, we'll decide whether to display this depending on whether the students is null or not. So what we'll do, I'm going to return a one thing. So I have to put a fragment around the card container and the button. So this one thing I will render depending on whether the students is null or not. Okay, so we can then now decide, so we'll do some JavaScript. So if there are no students, then we will return, then we will return this. Otherwise, if there are no students, then we'll have the message loading records. Now, we could say loading students or loading what modules or whatever, but I like to keep it generic in case we're going to refactor this later. So otherwise, we're going to return card container with all the cards in it and the button. So this is two things. So we have to wrap it in one thing in order to make that work. And then we'll close our curly bracket and close our component. So there we go. So if there are no students, then we're going to display this loading records message. Otherwise, we'll have a card container with all of the cards within it. Okay, so we'll save that. And we're seeing here loading records. So what happens is it can take many milliseconds to load from the API, sometimes hundreds of milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds would be a second. So there is a point here when there is nothing to display. So we might like to have this loading records message. So it's saying loading records. And of course, once it's loaded the records, which I haven't shown you how to do that yet, but once it's loaded that, then it can actually display the records. All right, so we've modified the view to handle the case when there isn't any data yet. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is load data from the API using the fetch, what's called the fetch API. Now, the code I'm going to write won't work, so I'm going to put it in anyway, in comments, so I can explain the sort of thing we're trying to do. So we're going to try and update the state with the response from the API. So first of all, we've got to go and get the response from the API, which is going to be a JSON data structure of some sort. So we'd have a const response equals, so we get a response from fetch, from the fetch API. Now we have to tell the fetch API what is the endpoint. So we need in here a variable endpoint, which is a string, which indicates what the endpoint we're trying to reach within the API. So we're going to have to configure that. So we'll go back up to the initialization here. And we're going to construct, let's pretend the user story is, I want to get the users that are in one of my groups, group 13, say. So const logged in user group. So this is the group I belong to. So we'll just pretend that's 13, as I know that's in the database. And we need to then put that into a string. So const endpoint. Now I'll just call this my group endpoint. And this is the thing that's going to appear, copy, inside our fetch. And you can use fetch many times going to the API to get different types of data. So this is just the first time we might reach in. So this is a string, and it's going to use this variable. So I'm going to use a template syntax. So we have, now we need to specify what the URL is, or the URI, http:// Now in my case, it's running on localhost. We will have a Unibase URL, which you can all use, but for the moment, it's not working. And it might be from Mockaroo, who knows, but this is where the URL goes. But at the moment, I'm using localhost. So localhost, and I'm running it on port 5000. And the first part of the string is called API. So then after that, the actual endpoint from the API, I want the users associated with the group 13. Okay, so that's the string that we're going to pass. So this is the syntax. So I'm actually just going to break this up a little bit. So we'll pop in here the API URL, API URL, and so that's this string here. So what have I done wrong? That's fine. API URL. So HTTP localhost 5000/API. So that's the actual string that indicates the API, and then the endpoint will concatenate those things together. So I'll get rid of this. I need a variable within the template. So it is called API URL. And you can imagine that being stored in some kind of global to this program. And I want users group, and then here, instead of having a magic number there, I'll have a variable. Oops. So I'll pop that variable in there. Okay, so I've constructed a string which indicates the API. So I've got the generic URL, then our particular endpoint configured with a local variable. And this is the thing that goes in here. Okay, so that's how you would go about constructing the URL string, popping it into fetch. Now, from fetch, you would then get the response object, and then we have to convert that JSON into a JavaScript object. So const result, so I'll call it result. So the result that we want, that we're going to update our state with, is equal to, we use the response object, and it response object, and it has a method called JSON, which converts from JSON into a JavaScript object. So we construct an endpoint as a string, we give that to the fetch returns a response object, which is JSON. That is then converted into a JavaScript object result, and then we do set students result. So that's how we would then update the state, and then which would cause the page to re-render. The loading message would go away, and we would map our way through rendering all the cards. Okay, so it won't work like this, but that'll give you a sense of what we're trying to achieve. Now, one of the reasons why this code won't work is because fetch and JSON method are asynchronous. That means that when they're called, they go and queue a job, and then they immediately return. So what we'd actually get back here from response is empty, because once this returns, this job has been queued to get data. Once it returns, response is empty. And then you pass this to the JSON object, it's empty, that fails, and what you get back is a result. And in fact, there's no way to rendezvous with the thread that's going off getting the data from the database. It will not come back for another few hundred milliseconds. So we have to use the async await syntax. Now, this is all about promises. This is some of the more esoteric elements of JavaScript that I don't really understand very fully, and I can budget into working. So, there's a big project for you to understand promises if you wish. There's another syntax which I've seen used, which is .then, and inside then you put this result, and that does the rendezvousing. So we run this, and then once that's finished, we then do the response. But we're not going to use that syntax. We're going to use a different syntax. Okay, now if we want to tell, this is an asynchronous function. If we want to tell the compiler that, we have to put in the await keyword in front of this. And indeed, also JSON method is also asynchronous, so we have to put await. Now, if we try to compile that, it won't know what this is, or rather it does, but it says it's got to be within an async function. So what we have to do is put this code inside a function. So we're going to define a function, const. We need to give it a name. I'm going to call it API get. And then we put this code inside this function, and then we'll have to call it. Now, I forgot to pop. Okay, so, oh, goodness gram. There we go. All right, so this is a function called API get, and why I've called it API get is we're going to the API, and we're going to we have a number of methods, HTTP methods we could use. Now, fetch, by default, if you don't tell it anything else, is doing a get method. You can tell it to go and do a post. You might remember that post is used when you're supplying with the fetch an object that you want to send to the server. There's also put, which we use to update data. So the post was to insert, the put was to update, There's also delete, which we use to delete stuff from the API. And there is get, which we do to read. So we've got read, update, insert, or create, read, update, and delete, the CRUD methods, and the associated HTML methods, which are post, CRUD, get, update, and delete. But that's in the future. For the moment, we're just doing a get, and therefore I've called this function API get. So you can imagine there's going to be variants of this API put, API post, etc. And it won't live here. You might have been wondering, why am I putting it here? It won't be here. Eventually, in the future, this will live in a file called API, which will have 4 methods: get, put, post, and delete. Okay, so we've defined it. It's complaining because it's saying you want this to be to become synchronous, essentially. So we have to say up here that the function is async. So it's an asynchronous function. Maybe I put that in the wrong place. No, that seems fine. And a couple of other issues. Async function. Await. Why is it complaining? Is declared but never used. I declared here. Response. Oh, can't spell. Response. And here it's declared but not used. So let's now use it. Actually, before that, we need to pass it the endpoint. Now we're going to reuse this. So it's not going to be my group endpoint. Actually, let's call it. So API get, we'll call it using my group endpoint. Okay. But we'll pop in here endpoint. It can be generic. So we want to reuse this function later on at some point. Okay, so we pass it the endpoint. The endpoint gets passed into here. We then do a fetch. We make it wait until the response happens. That then is popped into response object. We then call the JSON. We make it wait until that's completed and put in the result. And then the result we pass to the set students, which schedules the updating inside the React event loop. But it's pretty quick, but sometimes it takes a few milliseconds. Okay, so we've created a function that does what we want, and we call it. So we create an endpoint, we fetch the data we want from it, and then that updates the state. Okay, let's save this and see what happens. Control S. And voila. There are our users. Now, there's only 5 this time. There were 10 in that default list, but now there's only 5 because we are groups. In group work, we do groups of 5. So in the back end, the groups are of size 5. I can look at a different group, group 14. Save. We get a different set of people. Now, you saw that it hesitated. We'll go back to 13. So there was a bit of a hesitation, and that's because, although it appears to be working, there is in fact a problem. So if we open up this and then have a look at the console log. So here's the console. We are doing gets the whole time. So if I just grab the bottom get, click on it, or the bottom one, click. Let me try that again. Click on the bottom one. There we go. So here's the request and the response. Let's have a look at the response. Here are the 4 objects, the 5 objects rather. Close that. It's not the bottom one. There are more and more and more. Endlessly, we're getting these requests. We are in fact in an infinite loop where we are reaching out to the back end continuously for the same data and re-rendering it. So we're fetching and rendering, fetching and rendering, fetching and rendering endlessly, which is why it was hesitating earlier. So we have a problem. So let's go back to the code and see if we can see why. Okay, so it's all to do with updating state. The state has changed, so we run the function again. So this component, this function, when it first runs, the students is set to null. There's nothing there, so we get that loading message. And then we schedule a get, which may take a few milliseconds, tens of milliseconds. In the meantime, it returns and renders. And it renders this students is empty, loading records. And then this runs, this actually gets the data and updates the state. So state has changed. So this function is run again, in which we set the state. This bit isn't, this stays with the state, but we schedule a new get, and then we render this time with all the students in there, and they are all rendered. But then this executes and updates the state with the same information. The state has changed. So the functions run again. A new get is scheduled. Meantime, we render the cards. At some point later, the get responds, updates the state, and causing a re-render and a re-render and a re-render. So endlessly in this loop. So we have to find a way to stop this being run multiple times. And that's where I'm going to introduce a new hook, the use effect hook. Okay, so we import the use effect hook, and we use it by wrapping the function that we want to call within use effect. So use effect, and we're going to pop that in there. Now, we can't just call the function because it'll execute immediately, so we have to pass it a anonymous function. And we also need to make sure that that anonymous function is inside some curly brackets. Okay, now I don't totally understand that, but you'll get an error. It'll still work, but you'll get a warning if you don't. Okay, so it's going to, we're passing the use effect a function that we want to be called. Incidentally, use effect calls it after all the rendering, so it's scheduled for running, and then it returns and carries on with the render. And then it has a second argument where we put in the dependencies. So this is when we want it to run. Okay, so it looks like this. So we import the hook. Inside the hook, it's got two arguments. We pass an anonymous function, which includes the function that we want to call, the once or whenever the dependencies are met. Now, if we have no dependencies and we just put in an empty array, then use effect will call this function once, and that's what we want the first time to be called, and then subsequently we don't, in that second render, we don't want it to be called again. Now, Lint is complaining that we're missing an actual dependency, because there is a dependency, which is this string here. If that were to change, then of course we would want to load it in again. So we pop that into our dependency. Okay, so our dependency list. So use effect will only run the once, the first time, at any time that this string, the endpoint we're trying to reach, changes. So we do save, and then rerun this. Okay, so we can see that it's populated it with the data, but is it in an infinite loop? So let's open this up, do the inspect, and then let's have a look at the console. And in particular, let's look at any requests. So there are not thousands of requests going on there. In fact, let's just make sure, start again. Okay, and then there is the single request to the backend. It's not running endlessly. So we can use effect to that effect. Now, can we still add to that? Add, yeah, we can carry on adding away. Now, of course, we can't make these new people these new students persistent, because to do that we really have to reach out to the back end with a post and create these new entries in the database. but that's not the point of this particular video. Okay, so let's get rid of this. Make this smaller again, so we can rerun that just to get back to where we were before. Okay, so add one, new user. It's not persistent, but it's been added successfully to the state. Okay, so use effect is very, very important when we are in order to avoid things being rendered endlessly when we're using the fetch. And it's important. It's important that you add these extra curly brackets. Now you can actually, because there's only one thing within the brackets, you can do this. Just pop them like that. Okay, so where you don't need curly brackets, there's only one thing. So this will compile. So Control S. Okay, and it'll work. But if we open this up and look at console log, you'll see that it actually generates an error. So if I want to inspect console log, so we get this warning. So it's trying to get us to put the async definition inside the use effect as well. We don't have to, we can get around that with those curly brackets. Now this issue will go away once we remove, so let me just go back to where we were before, back to the code. Once we remove these API get and add it to API post and augment it with API put and API delete into its own class really, and then stick it in another file, then this problem is going to go away. But at the moment, we need to make sure that you've got those curly brackets in there. As I say, I don't really understand that, but that makes it all happy. So Control S. Okay, so just check that it's actually compiled properly. Control S and then reload. There we go. So it's all working. Okay, so let's recap what we've covered. So we introduced the notion of state. These are variables that React watches to look for changes. We can put things into state by using the useState hook, which we import from React. The useState hook, which we can use multiple times, so I can have lots of other type of variables that I'm watching. So perhaps it's an array of groups somewhere at the side, for instance, that we can click between. We can put any other things we want into state. The useState will return two functions, the variable that we want to use, and a function for changing the state. And essentially React is using this function here to flag which particular, what state has changed and what needs to be rendered. Just remind you that if any of your components, children components, contain state and that state changes, then the parents and the grandparent components will also re-render. So if we want to re-render, we pop our variables into state. And we have this nice deconstruction syntax to make everything easy. Okay, so the second thing we introduced was the fetch. So the fetch API is a set of methods that, well, it's one method really, that can reach out to a backend, an endpoint, and apply either a get, post, put, or delete method. If you don't say anything else, then it's going to assume it's a get. So the fetch API, you supply that with a string identifying the endpoint. Now it's an asynchronous function, so we need to use either the .then or the async await syntax. I suggest we all use the async await syntax, so that we're all doing the same thing. And we can then rendezvous basically with the fetch when it's completed to get our object. We then convert that object from JSON into JavaScript objects with the JSON method of the response, and then we can update the state. Now, because this is asynchronous functions, we have to define that within an asynchronous function itself. which we then can call. And this will go and update our state. So it will reach out to the database, return, in our case, an array of group objects, of people objects rather, and pop it into state, and then these will be rendered down in our view. Now there's a problem with the third thing we looked at. There's a problem with the infinite loops, so we only want this function to be applied once, or when any of its dependencies change, in this case the actual path. So you might change the logged in user, for instance, and therefore you do want to run it again. You might up here have a drop down menu where you control the user that you're looking at, in which case the endpoint would change and this would rerun and the new set of group members would be rendered. They would be loaded into state and rendered. So to get around that, we pop in our use effect, pop it in with a use effect, which we import from React. And that's basically that. These are all the key points that will allow you to take your current code, which is using a flat file, and reach out to the database. So at the moment you can't use localhost, obviously, because that's my computer and I'm just running the server there. So I will get you the appropriate API to use. The syntax here, users groups, or well, it depends of course on your user story. We'll talk about that offline, but there will be a URL and there will be a syntax that you can use to construct an endpoint, which you can then use inside your fetch. So good luck.